We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Making news just for you. It's July 3rd here in Seoul. I'm Suneung, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Kim Seong.
Good morning, Ian.
Good morning. And you may know her because we have a very special guest.
Very special.
She's my colleague and a reporter at Arirang News. It's Song Yujin.
Well, hello, News Gen fam. My name is Song Yujin. I'm currently news features reporter and culture correspondent at Arirang News. Lovely to be here today.
Welcome. Now,
Happy Monday, Yujin.
Thank you.
And both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. As usual, let's start with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Now, South Korea has sent a batch of firefighters to help Canada deal with raging wildfires across the country. A total of 151 people were sent. They're workers from not only the Fire Department and Forestry Ministry, but also the Foreign Ministry and Korean International Cooperation Agency. The relief team will be in Quebec until August 3rd. Canada has seen record wildfires this year. Around 8.8 million hectares have been scorched, which is around 40% of Korea's territory. Moving on, great news for women's tennis. Wimbledon has decided to reverse its ban on players wearing colored underwear. The All England club was under criticism for its strict all-white clothing policy. A number of players spoke out about the problem last year, especially female players who said it causes anxiety or embarrassment when they're on their period. And our last story is in France. Enraged Parisians came out to the street after a 17-year-old teen was fatally shot by police earlier this week. In light of the riots, French President Emmanuel Macron has decided to postpone his planned state visit to Germany, which has been scheduled for Sunday. Now, we're going to take a closer look at the last story. Why exactly are people so angry in France right now? Well, this is in response to the death of Nahel Merzouk, who has been shot dead during a traffic stop last Tuesday morning in Nanterre, and footage shows two officers standing on the driver's side of the car. One fired his gun at the 17-year-old driver, and though the officer said he only shot the gun fearing that the boy would run over someone with his car, many claim by the looks of the video, nobody seemed to be in immediate danger. The officer who fired the weapon is under formal investigation for voluntary homicide, and Parisians are also looking at this incident with a race angle to it, as the shot teen was of Algerian descent. Now, Yujin, since Nahel's death, we've seen so much rage and what French authorities are calling delinquency on the streets. What do you think about this story, though?
Well, first of all, like any other person, my heart goes out to the victim and the victims' families. And I really understand why a lot of Parisians are so infuriated about this. And that's because talks on police racism in France has been really going on for quite some time. And there has been a Reuters tally that shows that the lethal killing done by police in France has been rising consecutively. Last year, it was a record of 13 people, which was a lot. And the tally shows that the majority of victims were of Black or Arab origin. So I definitely get why people are so angry about it. I'm also angry about it as well. But I think that the protests could have been done in a more peaceful and non-violent way. And the reason is because when we see the news online, we've seen reports that the protesters have vandalized public buildings. And I also saw the news that a person was shot to death, which was really brutal. And even the victims' family members have said that they don't want this kind of violence. So I understand why they're trying to do this protest, but I think they should be done in a less violent way, because fighting violence with violence, I think it's not always the best way.
It's never the right answer. But what do you think about the whole situation in France, Xiong? We haven't seen this much unrest and rioting since 2005, when two teen boys died after hiding from police, right?
Yeah, I mean, police brutality seems to be a growing concern in the European continent itself. We've seen some cases in America as well. I mean, the killing of 17-year-old Nahel shows how little has changed since the deaths of the two teenagers fleeing police, as you said, in 2005. We've seen a few protests turn violent in France recently, largest and most recently the Yellow Vest movement as well. The number of cases of police brutality has been growing every year in France, and according to the Defender of Rights, young men perceived to be Black or of North African origin are 20 times more likely to be subjected to police identity checks also than the rest of the population. Similar to the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement in the US that began with the loss of George Floyd's life due to police brutality and the enforcement of COVID regulations by local authority, it seems that globally, especially in more racially diverse countries in Europe, are having rising racial concerns. I mean, this has been exacerbated by the increased number of refugees in Europe. I think this gives more of a growing concern than some of more racially less diverse countries like South Korea, which, you might not seem targeted police brutality as you do elsewhere.
Right, we don't see the race angle to police brutality here in South Korea, and it's definitely an issue we should keep our eyes on because the violence is continuing, and we hope here on NewsGen that this is curbed very soon. And that was our news feed for this Monday. Let's move on to today's discussion topic. Today we're going to be talking about something that has shaken up high school seniors and aspiring college students for a while now. South Korea's state-administered college entrance exam, Suneung, won't have any more so-called killer questions from this year. To find out more, take a look at the screen. Suneung. It's the make or break test that's held only once a year. You have to ace it to get into your dream college, which compared to other parts of the world is especially difficult here in South Korea. It takes 9 hours to finish. Until now, test makers inserted killer questions that are high difficulty questions to differentiate test takers and their scores. But recently, the Education Ministry has decided to get rid of them. That's because teachers said these questions require university-level knowledge, which can only be obtained through private tutoring or at academies. These options are only available to students from households that can't afford them. Today, NewsGen aims to answer 3 questions. 1. What are the main arguments surrounding the killer question controversy in Korea? 2. What do young people in Korea think about this? 3. How much do we prioritize and rely on private education in Korea? As people who've experienced this, what are our thoughts on this? So today we'll be talking about the major changes made to the Suneung from this November. We won't be seeing any more killer questions, and this has stirred a lot of controversy. So Eugene, why don't you tell us? You've been following the story for quite a while now.
Right.
So what's the controversy we're seeing?
Well, I think this controversy all boils down to the Korean government's efforts to really curb the excessive private education spending. That's been one of the biggest headaches that the country has been facing. So that's because these cram schools, often called hagwons here in Korea, specialize in teaching these students how to solve these killer questions quickly and accurately. And President Yoon himself has been really vocal about the need to eliminate these killer questions that go beyond the scope of the high school curriculum. And I want to point out that the Suneung exam is preceded by 2 mock tests, once in June and once in September. And the June mock test this year didn't turn out to be easy. So it actually included the killer questions, which really made the president urge the education minister to get rid of these killer questions in the future, which really made the education ministry to kind of unveil its plans to curb private education. And one of the main pillars was removing killer questions in this year's Suneung, starting from this year's Suneung. And I think
it will be implemented this November.
Right, this November, because Suneung always takes place in November as well. And there are kind of contrasting views because there are some people who are for this decision because they think it will help curb private education. But on the other hand, some people are pointing out that there are only 5 months left to the Suneung exam, which could really cause a chaos for all these test takers.
And could you relate? Because I know you took the Suneung, right?
Right.
And you also have been through all these types of private education in cram schools?
Yes, I've been through all those hagwons.
And we'll hear about your experience very soon. Now, as Eugene mentioned, Xiong, this was a directive to try and get more students out of private education. And before we find out how exactly this is going to work, why don't you walk us through how much an average Korean household spends on private education?
Yeah, I mean, so this idea of cramming schools and hagwons isn't very new. I mean, Korea's reliance on private education has a prevailing history. In 1980, there was even a countrywide ban on private academies and education to prevent further spread of expensive private education that threw the public education system off balance. The killer questions in Suneung reached its pinnacle in 2018 and continued onwards with subjects like Kugo, Korean language, science and maths, and English taking turns being extremely difficult, really sort of fueling the trend of hagwons and private education in your homes. In 2022, last year, 78% 78.3% of the entire country's primary, middle and high school students were enrolled in paid private education on top of attending designated public schools. I prepared a chart to show you exactly how of a burden private education is to students and parents in South Korea. According to Statistics Korea, average households with children aged 13 to 19 currently enrolled in private academies, same or more money was spent on private education than food, regardless of your household income levels. So of the income level quintile, the bottom 20% income level spent around $400, which exactly matched their spending on foods, whilst the top 20% spent around $1,060, almost twice as much as the $560 they spent on food. So now this shows just how big of a percentage of household income is spent on private education in South Korea.
I mean, it's no surprise. I grew up with a lot of friends, including myself, who went to private education, and it's costly.
It's costly, and it's just a normal thing. Like, you're expected to do it. You know, sometimes you're left out in your friends group because all these kids of your neighborhood, of your school, goes to this private education after class, and if you're not enrolled in one of these, then you just stay home.
You're left out. Friends. Exactly. You're like, hey, where are you going after school? They're like,
ridiculous.
I'm going to Hapwon, cram schools. And Yujin, you've mentioned very briefly before that you took the Suneung, and the reason why we brought you here today on today's show is because you have experience going to cram schools and going through the Korean education system step by step. And do you think the education ministry has it right, though? Do you think taking killer questions out of the state-administered college entrance exam reduces students' reliance on private education? Are you for or against this controversy at the moment?
Well, so based on my more than decade-long experience living in Korea and going through all the Korean college entrance process, I definitely agree that the government is going through the right direction because the primary reason why parents and students are going to cram schools and consuming a private education is to prepare them better for the Suneung exam. And I actually have a data that proves this. So,
Let's hear it.
Yeah, so according to a poll, a survey done by the Education Ministry in May, 45% of parents who had middle or high school students answered the main reason why they're sending their kids to these cram schools is to better and fully prepare them for the Suneung exam, which is based on relative evaluation system. So if we get rid of the killer questions, then one less reason for these parents and students to go to these cram schools. This is a reason why I think we are going to the right direction, but I want to point out that this is not enough because I think that this could create another vicious cram school and Suneung preparation cycle because, as I mentioned, Suneung is based on relative evaluation, then students will still work to get one score higher, nail one more question better than their peers. Then I think that this will lead to a creation of new cram schools that specialize in teaching students how to get all these questions right.
Right. A lot of experts are saying that you can't even make a simple mistake now. Because without these killer questions, it's really hard to distinguish who did a better job, which performance could lead you into your dream
That's
school.
why killer questions were in place in the beginning. Because, 2018, English became relative, absolute grading system, and that turned all the other subjects really difficult.
Exactly. Now, even though you've never taken the Suneung Xiang, you've also been to many private academies and tutoring options here in South Korea. So what do you think about our country's heavy reliance on private education? And do you agree with officials that it's really unfair?
Oh, definitely. I wholeheartedly agree that it is unfair and believe that such action for change has been really, really long overdue. I've also personally been through this sort of arduous, expensive journey that takes its toll on both my parents and my siblings, as well as all the friends I see around me.
Too.
Myself as well. And I mean, I think it's a system, it's also widely blamed by teachers, parents, researchers and policymakers for a list of problems, from inequality in education to even mental illness in the youth, and even the country's sort of plummeting fertility rate. Because, you're expected to spend so much money on children's education that you don't even think that's a viable option for you. And that has been taking place for so long that it seems like we need change. As you mentioned as well, Eugene, it seems like even if we do make a change, get rid of the killer questions, we might have more management, time management, sort of hagwon, private academies, focusing on other aspects of Suneung, even though the killer questions might be gone. So I wholeheartedly agree. that we should try to cut down private education as much as we can.
But I think the problem right now is how are we going to do that? It's been here for so long. It's a years-long tradition. And to find out, we're going to include an associate professor in our talks who actually recently wrote an editorial on this issue. We'll include him in our talks right after this. Let's now include an expert in our talks. He's an assistant professor of English at Chongshin University in Seoul, and he recently wrote an article on this issue. It's Professor Scott Shepard. Welcome, Professor Shepard.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
All right, I did read your article, but for our viewers, could you explain your stance on the latest Suneung issue, taking out killer questions?
Well, if we start with the definition of a killer question as a question which you can't answer if you haven't had private education, and we think of the Suneung as a national exam testing what students have learned in school, then I think it's pretty obvious that we shouldn't have killer questions in the exam. That's the whole point of a national exam, seeing what you learn in school. So President Yoon was absolutely right to take away the killer questions from the Suneung. Maybe the timing was badly handled, the announcement 5 months before the exams, maybe not too wise, but the decision itself was absolutely right, and we could spend ages exploring why that is right. But if we do focus so much on the killer questions, then I think we're missing the more important issue at stake here, which is the Suneung itself. If we started in a new country together and we said tomorrow, like, what kind of exam system do we want to make? What kind of university system, like university entrance exam, do we want to make? We wouldn't come up with anything that looks anything like the Suneung. It's an 8-hour exam on one day with multiple choice questions, and it's really measuring your endurance more than your academic ability or anything else. And I can't really talk so much about all the other subjects, but if we look at the English section, I don't really get what it is that they're trying to assess, because they're not assessing your ability to communicate, and they're not assessing your creativity or imagination. There are some questions of comprehension and listening which may be valid, but really the whole point of the exam is just to winnow out the students so that you kind of create a top tier and then a lower tiers of students, and you can send them to their respective universities. And it's not necessarily true, I don't think, that the people who achieve the greatest scores are necessarily the most creative thinkers or the most hard workers or even the most intelligent, or however you want to describe it. They're just good at taking long multiple choice exams. They're good at enduring for a long day of tests. Right. So some of those skills are good, but they're not necessarily the most important ones. And if we're going to think about the Suneung, we just have to restart. I think we have to completely restart. This shouldn't be a multiple choice section where you have 4 or 5 boxes and you can't think outside the box. We should have a complete rethink of what we're doing here.
Right, change up the evaluation system as a whole.
Scott, I think it would be nice to for us to make a bit of a comparison to the international different countries' systems. I myself did take the A levels in the UK. I did a Cambridge pre-U course as well. So, I mean, what do you think about South Korea's heavy reliance on private education itself, and how would you compare it to the UK? Are there any examples of private education there?
Well, I also grew up in the UK, and I spent my whole life there. I don't know the statistics exactly, but I can say personally, I never paid for any kind of academic education until I got to university. So my parents paid for guitar lessons for me because I wanted to learn the guitar. But apart from that, we didn't spend a penny on my education. And, there are definitely problems with the UK system. There is private tutoring there as well, we should know.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of problems with every education system, and the UK is no different. But if we compare that with Korea, the system in Korea itself, the system seems to be causing harm, both physical and mental, to the students who take it and also to the wider society. I think, you already mentioned the statistics that, households are spending the same amount or more on food or housing as they are on education, on private education. And that's something which is not sustainable. If people can't afford to have children, they won't have children. And we can see that Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world. And there's a clear reason. I don't think it's just one simple, solution, that the Suneung itself is the only problem, but it's definitely part of the problem.
Then, Professor Shepard, I want to ask you, are you for or against trying to get students to rely more on public education rather than private education? And in order to do that, what do you think should be done?
And Professor Shepard, due to time, if you could give us one solution, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are definitely worse things you can spend your money on than private education, that's for sure. And I'm not against private education per se, but I think a heavy reliance on it is a problem. So my solution is just restart, completely rethink the Suneung. It would take several years and it would take a long time to implement, but I think that's the way to go.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor Shepard. It was great to hear from you today.
Lovely.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, and before we continue our talks, we're also going to hear what our global viewers had to say on today's topic. Take a look at the screen to find out what 3 of them had to say. Benny D97 said the Philippines has like some huge college entrance exams for top universities in either public or private settings, and they can choose based on their dream course. Kettle Potato said, I'm from the United States. More and more schools are either making SATs optional, not required, or omitting test scores altogether on college applications because they become a corporate commodity, driving up prices and thus becoming a product for the wealthy class. I think Professor Shepard would like this comment. And Akpopiku said, I'm from India, and there's a very tough entrance exam for any government university. Now, I would now like to wrap up the discussion topic by saying Professor Shepard said taking out killer questions, changing up the whole Suneung is really necessary for South Koreans, especially since we're seeing a heavy reliance on private education. So as millennials and Gen Z, who's been there and done that with South Korea's education system, what do you guys think is the main problem, and could give me one solution to tackle this?
I mean, in my opinion, I think the main problem here is the competition that exists in South Korean society as well as its education system. So, I mean, what we call Sky University, the top 3 universities in Korea, are all located in Seoul. About 23 million people are also living in Seoul, which is, almost half the entire country's population. And with more than 70% of all students in Sky universities living in Seoul or its surrounding Gyeonggi province as well. So it becomes really, really unfair for all the other students living elsewhere.
Yeah.
So I personally think creating more of a skills speciality for students and allowing them to try a variety of vocations to find the one that fits is hugely more advantageous for the youth of Korea. Academia is definitely not for everyone, and there are numerous other creative ways to make a living these days, and so leave the studying for the ones who genuinely want to commit to research and academia and have a dream of exploring the more sort of research-based professions.
More vocational options.
Exactly.
And Eugene, you've been there, done that. You seriously have.
Yeah.
But would you want to see other youth go through the same process, or how would you like to see it change?
Well, I think the change I want to see the most is kind of getting rid of this overly competitive and hierarchical education system and the atmosphere here in Korea. I think this is what really triggers more demand toward private education because we kind of have a tendency, Korea kind of has a tendency to say that if you go to the so-called top-tier universities, you can get a good job. So I think that what the government can do is to really spread out and really establish and develop universities outside the capital region, more attractive options for students.
And another option could be blind recruitment. Nowadays, we're seeing more companies try to recruit people regardless of which university they're from. And we'll be here every day from 9:30 to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics young people are talking about. Special thanks to Kim Seong.
My pleasure.
And Song Yejin, it was a pleasure to have you here today.
Yeah,
I have
so
to
lovely.
say, and it was the best way to start my Monday.
It was the best day of the whole month for me.
Thank you.
It's only like July 3rd. Anyway, and thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. We are
New Generation.